Well, thank you very much for joining me on this video. I received a phone call from an agent the other day telling me that she in turn had received a phone call from a client asking her to come over and list their property. Well, she attended at the property, started discussing the condition of the property and going over the listing form with the homeowner. And in the discussion, it came up that there was a buried oil tank on the property. And this oil tank had been disconnected from the property and opened up and filled with sand and gravel and covered over, so it was under the ground. And she said, is that a problem? Very, very definitely a problem. First of all, we would classify it as a latent defect. Now, it's latent because it's hidden. It isn't readily observable. Even if you have a building inspector, they're going to go over, unless they have some kind of a metal detector that are wandering across the ground, they're not going to know that that oil tank is below grade. So it's latent. But is it a defect? Absolutely, it's a defect. As soon as you're dealing with the oil, you're dealing with the potential for a spill. It could happen that sometime when they're topping the tank up and it spills over and leaches down the sides of the tank. It could happen because the tank is steel and it's in the ground where it's constantly getting wet by rain soaking into the soil. It could be that there's a rupture in the tank. And it could be that that oil is leaching into the ground. If you ever buy or are involved in the sale of a commercial or industrial property, it's often the case that they request an environmental audit. Usually they begin with a phase one. Now, a phase one isn't an examination of the property. Phase one is going and examining the records to find out what the history of the property is. And as they search back, if they find out that at one time it was a dry cleaning operation or a service station, it immediately raises a red flag. The service station, because exactly the same thing, buried tanks, and there's the potential for a spill of gasoline or leaking out of the tanks and leaking into the ground. And if it does, that has to be remedied. So, back to this individual one, is it a problem? Yes, it is a problem. What does the seller have to do? Well, the first thing they would have to do is they would have to provide notification to any interested parties, any potential buyers, that there is in fact a latent defect in the property. Now, the other thing that they could do, and I always encourage them to do this, is if they can remedy the system, it's better. So if they can somehow solve the problem so there is no longer a latent defect, there's nothing to disclose, and away they go. But it's not that simple. They have to dig down and remove this tank. Remember I said the tank was full of sand and gravel. Can you imagine what that thing would weigh? They may have to cut the top off it and scoop out all the sand and gravel before they remove the tank. Once the tank is removed, they're going to have to test the soil and make sure that there weren't any spills or any leakage of oil that could have leached into the soil. If there is, they're going to have to remove the soil and replace it with good soil, backfill up to grade, and then level it off. Once they've done that, they've solved the problem. There's no longer a latent defect. Let me say something about what RICO has to say about latent defects. RICO says failing to disclose a latent defect might be considered a misrepresentation of the state of the property and lead to litigation. Even if a seller does not have direct knowledge of a latent defect, they may still be liable if they were willfully blind about the existence of the defect. A seller who attempts to hide or cover up a latent defect faces additional liability. So we would go to our form number 299, and form 299 is the form that we would use to notify parties of a latent defect. And it's pretty simple to use. You spell out what category it is and spell out what the latent defect is. You get the seller to sign it. And then it's very important to also get a potential buyer, or shall we say interested party, to receive it and acknowledge that they have received it. And they've got to do that before they submit an offer. And I want to tell you something. It's very, very important that the seller make sure that the interested party acknowledges having receipt. Some years ago, we had a property listed in Welland, and the salesperson back then did a seller property information statement and notified parties that the basement was prone to leak in the spring. The basement was unfinished, and they said get moisture in such and such a corner in the spring. That was in the seller property information statement. And it indicated on the listing that there was a seller property information statement available. Well, the agent who was representing the buyer showed the property, brought in an offer. The buyer's offer was accepted, the deal closed, and the following spring, the property leaked. The basement got some water coming in. So the first thing, we got a phone call where the agent for the buyer was requesting a copy of the SPIS. We notified the seller, made sure they were comfortable with it, and provided them with a copy of the SPIS. They looked at it, and it said right in there, yes, the basement leaks. We thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. They took it to court. Our errors and omission people got involved. It went to court, and we lost. We said, we told clearly any buyer through the SPIS that there was a problem, what we call a latent defect. And the judge said that's not good enough. They may have an inept agent on their end. It's up to the seller to make sure that they know about it. So the onus was on us to notify parties. So how do we do that? Well, we use the form and we get the seller to sign the acknowledgement of latent defect, and we get the buyer to sign acknowledgement of receipt of it. But how do you discover latent defects? I mean, if the homeowner hadn't raised the issue about a buried tank, the agent never would have known. What we need to do is we need to, first, at one point in time, we used the seller property information statement. And the seller property information statement was an exhaustive questionnaire, and it would uncover latent defects. The problem with it, and a lot of lawyers, especially representing sellers, hated it because it also highlighted patent defects, which you don't have to disclose. And RICO takes the position, if you use an SPIS, you have to make it available. In fact, I'll quote from one of their video series. It says, if a registrant has a seller as a client, and the seller has prepared a written statement about the property that is intended to provide information to buyers about the real estate, the registrant must disclose the existence of the written statement to every buyer who expressed an interest in the real estate. And if the buyer asks for a copy of the statement, the registrant must provide it as soon as possible after the request is made. So that's under Tressa's training, and that comes from RICO. So it says if you do an SPIS, even if it's got patent defects that the seller necessarily doesn't want to disclose, you have to make that available if it's requested. Of course, as I said, if it's latent defects there, that's not good enough. Not a case of request. You got to make sure they get it. Well, what's the solution? The solution is to use the residential information checklist, which is Form 820. And you take that residential information checklist, it's the same thing as an SPIS, except that it isn't required to be given to the other party. Same questions, but not for distribution. And in fact, RICO goes on to say, the requirement to share with buyers does not apply, however, to information a seller shares with their registrant to assist the registrant to sell the property, but was not intended to be shared with potential buyers. So the fact that you use an information checklist instead of an SPIS solves the problem of having to notify or provide it to potential buyers, but it highlights to you the kind of questions you need to zero down on in case there's potential latent defects. So what do? When you're taking the listing, and I would suggest you always do this, use the Residential Information Checklist, Form 820, go through it thoroughly and in depth, and discover if there are any latent defects. If there are any latent defects, discuss with the seller whether or not they can be remedied. Now, some can't, and some are, let's say, stigmas. They're not really a latent defect, but the feeling is they need to be disclosed, like somebody dying in the property. You can't undo that. So there may be things you can't fix, but if the seller can fix it, get them to fix it. Now, once it's been remedied, there are no latent defects. But if they can't be remedied, you have to document the latent defect in the Form 299 and then make absolutely sure that all interested parties have a copy of it, have acknowledged they received a copy of it before they prepare and submit an offer. Hope that makes sense. Thank you for investing your time. Talk to you again next week.